Another day, another story. In an effort to raise funds to pay off debts and defend the vast new American territories won from the French in the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, the British government passes the Stamp Act on March 22, 1765. The legislation levied a direct tax on all materials printed for commercial and legal use in the colonies, from newspapers and pamphlets to playing cards and dice. Though the Stamp Act employed a strategy that was a common fundraising vehicle in England, it stirred a storm of protest in the colonies. Welcome to Tabot Eminent Channel. The colonists had recently been hit with three major taxes: the Sugar Act, 1764, which levied new duties on imports of textiles, wines, coffee and sugar; the Currency Act, 1764, which caused a major decline in the value of the paper money used by colonists; and the Quartering Act, 1765, which required colonists to provide food and lodging to British troops under certain circumstances. With the passing of the Stamp Act, the colonists' grumbling finally became an articulated response to what they saw as the mother country's attempt to undermine their economic strength and independence. They raised the issue of taxation without representation, and formed societies throughout the colonies to rally against the British government and nobles who sought to exploit the colonies as a source of revenue and raw materials. By October of that year, 9 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress, at which the colonists drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document that railed against the autocratic policies of the mercantilist British Empire. Realizing that it actually cost more to enforce the Stamp Act in the protesting colonies than it did to abolish it, the British government repealed the tax the following year. The fracas over the Stamp Act, though, helped plant seeds for a far larger movement against the British government and the eventual battle for independence. Most important of these was the formation of the Sons of Liberty, a group of tradesmen who led anti-British protests in Boston and other seaboard cities, and other groups of wealthy landowners who came together from across the colonies. Well after the Stamp Act was repealed, these societies continued to meet in opposition to what they saw as the abusive policies of the British Empire. Out of their meetings, a growing nationalism emerged that would culminate in the fighting of the American Revolution only a decade later. The Stamp Act of 1765 was a law passed by the British Parliament that imposed a direct tax on the American colonies. It required that many printed materials, such as newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, and pamphlets, be produced on stamped paper, which carried an official revenue stamp. The story of the Stamp Act, a spark for revolution in 1765, the American colonies were bustling with activity, merchants selling goods, lawyers drafting contracts, and newspapers printing the latest news. But then, a decision made thousands of miles away in London sent shockwaves through the colonies. A British problem, an American burden. The British Empire had just emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, but the victory came at a heavy price, a massive national debt. To recover, Prime Minister George Grenville and Parliament decided that the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. The solution? On March 22, 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, requiring colonists to purchase special stamped paper for everything from newspapers and legal documents to playing cards and even ship manifests. Without the proper stamp, documents would be considered invalid. No taxation without representation. At first, many colonists couldn't believe it. Aliamanu, a New Year's celebration, took a tragic turn after a massive explosion, caused by what officials confirmed were illegal fireworks, left at least 3 people dead and over 20 people hospitalized in critical and serious condition. A direct tax imposed without their consent? This was unheard of. In Britain, taxes were approved by Parliament, where elected representatives spoke for the people. But the colonies had no representatives in Parliament. This led to the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." The outrage spread quickly. In Boston, lawyer James Otis denounced the tax as unconstitutional. Newspapers, like the Pennsylvania Gazette, urged resistance. Merchants worried that the tax would cripple their businesses. Protests turned violent. In August 1765, a mob gathered in Boston, led by a secret group known as the Sons of Liberty. They burned an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the British official responsible for enforcing the Stamp Act. Days later, they stormed his house, smashing windows and burning furniture. Across the colonies, similar protests erupted. In Virginia, Patrick Henry gave a fiery speech before the House of Burgesses, warning King George III that he risked the fate of Julius Caesar if he ignored the people's rights. Boycotts and the Stamp Act Congress. Rather than pay the tax, colonists began boycotting British goods. Merchants in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston refused to import British products until the act was repealed. At the same time, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress. They drafted a petition to the king, arguing that Britain had no right to tax them without their consent. A humiliating defeat for Britain. The protests worked. British merchants, suffering from the American boycott, pressured Parliament to repeal the act. On March 18, 1766, just a year after it was passed, the Stamp Act was repealed. Along with repealing the tax, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that it had the right to tax the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. Though the colonists celebrated their victory, the battle for independence had only just begun. The resentment and resistance sparked by the Stamp Act would grow into a full-scale revolution just a decade later. The Stamp Act, a nation's first rebellion. It was a cold March morning in 1765 when news arrived in the American colonies. Parliament had passed the Stamp Act. At first, many colonists didn't understand the full weight of what this meant. But as word spread, so did the anger. A brewing storm in Boston, a young printer's apprentice named Sam Carter was helping his master prepare the latest edition of the Boston Gazette. His master, a known critic of British rule, stormed into the workshop with a grim face. "They expect us to pay a tax just to print the news? A tax that none of us approved?" he spat, slamming his ink-stained hands on the table. Sam, just 15, looked up. "What are we going to do?" His master grinned. "We print the truth." That day, the Boston Gazette published a scathing attack on the Stamp Act, calling it a direct assault on liberty. Across the city, other printers did the same. The fire of rebellion had been lit. The Stamp Act Congress, a united front. For the first time in history, the colonies banded together. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City. Inside a dimly lit tavern, the men debated. Some feared outright rebellion, but others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, believed that without resistance, Britain would keep tightening its grip. The British give in, for now. By early 1766, British merchants began losing money due to American boycotts. Business owners pressured Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, warning that British trade was collapsing. Finally, on March 18, 1766, King George III signed the repeal. The colonies erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, toasts were made, and for a brief moment, it seemed like victory had been won. But hidden in the fine print of British law was something far more dangerous, the Declaratory Act. This new law made it clear, Parliament still claimed the right to rule the colonies. The battle over the Stamp Act was over, but the fight for freedom had just begun. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.